At some point in history, in almost every society that has ever gone to war, ordinary people cheered. Not the generals, not the politicians, not the people with something to gain from the conflict. Ordinary people. Farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, parents, people who would lose sons and brothers and husbands to the fighting, people whose towns would be bombed, whose food supply would be cut, whose savings would be consumed by the cost of a war they had no hand in starting. They cheered anyway. They volunteered. They pressured their neighbors to volunteer. They reported people who questioned the war to the authorities. They defended the conflict with a conviction so complete that challenging it felt not like a difference of opinion, but like a moral attack on everything they held sacred. And then, in many cases, years later, after the casualties, after the destruction, after the promised victory failed to arrive or arrived at a cost nobody had honestly calculated, some of those same people could not fully explain what had happened to them, how the certainty had felt so total, where it had come from, why dissent had seemed not just wrong but monstrous. The easy explanation is manipulation, that the population was lied to, that propaganda did its work, and ordinary people were deceived into supporting something they would never have chosen with accurate information. That explanation is partially correct, and almost completely insufficient, because the research on war support does not primarily reveal a story of passive deception. It reveals something more unsettling. It reveals a population that was not simply manipulated into supporting a war, but that was, in many cases, actively seeking the conditions that war provides. Psychologically, neurologically, at a level below the arguments and the justifications in the official narratives. The need that war meets in a population is real. It predates the specific conflict. And understanding what that need is, where it comes from and what it does to the brain, is the only way to understand why this pattern repeats with such consistency across cultures, across centuries, across every form of political organization human beings have ever tried. I'm Dr. Evan Cole. This channel is the neuroscience underneath human behavior, the mechanism-level explanation for why people do what they do, not what we assume about them from the outside. If this is your first time here, the archive has more than 25 episodes worth your time. Today, why populations support wars that destroy them. Not the political history, the psychological and neurological mechanism. What war does to the brain, what needs it meets, and why the pattern of ordinary people supporting their own destruction is not an anomaly of history. It is a feature of human psychology operating exactly as designed. Let's establish the question precisely, because it is easy to misframe it in a way that makes the answer seem obvious when it isn't. The question is not, why do people support a war they believe will benefit them? That requires no explanation. Self-interest is a sufficient answer. The question is, why do populations support wars that demonstrably harm them? Wars that consume the lives of their children, destroy their economies, reduce their standard of living, and frequently end without the promised outcome. And do so with genuine conviction, not reluctant compliance. And frequently end without the promised outcome. And do so with genuine conviction, not reluctant compliance. The answer is not simply propaganda, not simply nationalism, not simply fear of the state's coercive apparatus, though all of these contribute. The answer is located in the specific psychological needs that war activates in a population. War, at the psychological level, is not primarily a political event. It is a social psychological event, and the needs it meets, for meaning, for belonging, for identity consolidation, for the resolution of existential anxiety, are real needs. Needs that existed before the war. Needs that the war did not create. Needs that the war is, in the short term, uniquely effective at satisfying. The neurological foundation of war support begins with a function the brain performs constantly and that most people are almost entirely unaware of. The brain does not tolerate meaninglessness, not passively, not in the way a person might dislike an unpleasant taste and simply avoid it. The brain actively generates meaning, continuously, because the absence of a coherent framework for why things happen and what they mean produces a specific neurological state, existential anxiety, that the system treats as threat. Terror management theory, developed by psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pischinsky, drawing on the work of cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker, proposes that a significant portion of human behavior is organized around the management of one specific anxiety, the awareness of mortality, the knowledge, unique among animals, that we will die, that everything we build and care about will eventually cease to exist, that we are, in Becker's formulation, mortal animals who know they are mortal. The brain's primary management strategy for this anxiety is cultural worldview investment, attaching the self to something larger, a nation, a religion, a cause, an ideology that will outlast the individual body, meaning that transcends the individual life, something worth dying for, which is also something that makes the death mean something. War activates this system with a precision and completeness that almost nothing else in peacetime social life can match. In wartime, the questions that existential anxiety generates: why does my life matter? What am I part of? What would I sacrifice myself for? Receive immediate, unambiguous answers. The nation is under threat. Your participation is required. The cause is just. The enemy represents everything that must be opposed. Your suffering is meaningful. Your potential death is not meaningless biological termination. It is the highest possible expression of what you value. Terror management theory research consistently shows that mortality salience, the experimental condition of making people aware of their own death, reliably increases support for the in-group, hostility toward the out-group. Terror management theory research consistently shows that mortality salience, the experimental condition of making people aware of their own death, reliably increases support for the in-group, hostility toward the out-group, and attachment to worldviews that position the self as part of something that transcends individual life. War is not a laboratory manipulation of mortality salience. It is the total immersion of an entire population in it. The neurological effect is specific and measurable. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone released in contexts of social trust and cooperation, surges in populations engaged in collective conflict. The feeling of unity, of shared purpose, of being part of something larger than the self, is not a metaphor in wartime. It is a documented neurochemical state, and it is, for many people, the most intense experience of meaning and belonging they will ever feel. This is the core of the paradox. The war that is destroying the population is simultaneously providing that population with the most neurologically rewarding social experience available to the human brain. The destruction and the reward arrive together, and the brain, oriented toward the reward it is currently experiencing, struggles to fully weigh the destruction it is currently sustaining. There is a second mechanism operating simultaneously, and it explains not just why people support wars initially, but why support persists even as the evidence of destruction accumulates. Psychologist Henri Teifel's social identity theory established that people derive significant self-esteem from group membership, that the group's status is experienced as personal status, that threats to the group are processed as personal threats, and critically, that once identity is invested in a group's cause, contradictory information is processed not as evidence to be evaluated, but as an attack on the self to be defended. In the context of war, this mechanism produces what researchers call sunk cost entrenchment, the psychological dynamic in which prior investment in a position makes abandonment of that position increasingly costly to the self-concept. The more a person has publicly supported a war, the more they have celebrated it, argued for it, pressured others to support it, defined their identity around it. The more withdrawing that support requires a confrontation with everything they have done and said and believed. It is not simply admitting the war was wrong. It is admitting that the version of themselves that supported it, the patriot, the true believer, the person who knew what the confused and cowardly did not, was wrong. The identity cost of that admission is enormous. And the brain, which is not primarily a truth-seeking machine but a consistency-maintaining machine, generates every available rationalization to avoid paying it. The casualties were necessary, the intelligence was flawed, but the cause was right. The war would have been won if the will had held. Defeat was the result of betrayal from within. These are not the conclusions of fools. They are the conclusions of people whose identity protection system is functioning exactly as designed, producing the most coherent available narrative that allows the self-concept to remain intact. There is a third mechanism without which war support at the population level is not psychologically sustainable, and it is the most disturbing of the three. For a population to sustain support for a war that is killing large numbers of people on the other side, and in modern warfare, large numbers of civilians, that inhibition must be addressed. The inhibition is neurologically real. It is not weakness, it is a deeply embedded pro-social constraint. For a population to sustain support for a war that is killing large numbers of people on the other side, that inhibition must be addressed. Dehumanization is not primarily a conscious process. Research in social neuroscience, including work by Lasana Harris and Susan Fiske at Princeton, shows that when people are cued to view an outgroup as less than fully human, the medial prefrontal cortex, the brain region associated with social cognition, with attributing mental states to others, shows reduced activation. The dehumanized person is processed not as a full human subject with an interior life, but as an object, a category, a threat. This neural shift does not require explicit propaganda claiming the enemy is subhuman. It is activated by more subtle cues, the consistent use of de-individualizing language, the framing of enemy casualties as numbers rather than people, the steady association of the enemy group with threat, contamination, and moral corruption. The population does not need to consciously believe the enemy is not human. The neural processing shift happens below that level, and once it has happened, the inhibition against supporting the harm of that group is substantially weakened. The fourth mechanism is the one that operates on the people who do not, initially, support the war. Individual dissent against a war that a population has collectively committed to is not merely unpopular. It is psychologically costly in ways that go beyond social disapproval. It threatens the group's existential management system. If the war is the mechanism through which the population is managing collective anxiety about meaning, mortality, and identity, then the person who challenges the war is not simply offering an alternative political view. They are threatening the mechanism itself. The social response to wartime dissent, the accusation of cowardice, of disloyalty, of being aligned with the enemy, is not irrational. It is proportional to the threat the dissent actually poses to the collective psychological system. Psychologist Charlene Nemeth's research on minority influence documents what happens to individuals who maintain positions that contradict established group consensus under pressure. The social cost is real and sustained. Group members do not simply disagree with the dissenter. They respond with active hostility proportional to the perceived threat to group cohesion. This produces a specific dynamic in wartime populations. People who have private doubts do not express them. Not because the state forces silence, though sometimes it does, but because the social cost of visible dissent is genuinely prohibitive. And the absence of expressed dissent creates the impression of consensus, which makes the remaining doubters even more reluctant to speak, which deepens the apparent consensus further. The silence is not evidence of agreement. It is evidence of a social environment in which disagreement has become too costly to voice. And in that environment, the war continues to appear to have the support it is actually only producing through the suppression of alternatives. The mechanisms that produce war support in populations are not new. They have been operating in recognizably similar forms across the full recorded span of human history. The question of whether they can be interrupted, whether populations can be made more resistant to them, is one the research addresses with cautious, qualified optimism. The most consistent finding is that the primary protection is not more information. Populations with access to accurate information about wars' costs have supported wars as enthusiastically as populations without it. Information is processed through the identity and meaning systems. It does not bypass them. What shows more consistent effects is what researchers call moral disengagement interruption, specifically the deliberate personalization of the people on the other side of the conflict. Research on intergroup contact theory, developed by Gordon Allport and extended significantly since, documents that direct, humanizing contact with members of an outgroup is the single most effective known intervention against dehumanization. Not arguments about shared humanity. Actual contact, actual individual relationships, the kind of specific personal knowledge of another human being that the dehumanization mechanism cannot survive. The second protective factor is historical education that is specific about mechanism rather than general about outcome. Populations that understand how war support is produced, that have been taught the specific psychological processes that were operating in historical populations who supported conflicts now widely regarded as catastrophic, show measurably greater resistance to those same processes when they encounter them. Not immunity, resistance. Enough friction in the system to slow the automatic operation of the mechanisms. And the third is the protection of the conditions under which dissent is possible. The social silencing of wartime doubt is not inevitable. Societies that have built and maintained institutional protections for minority viewpoints, that have created cultural norms around the legitimacy of questioning, even of sacred collective commitments, are not immune to war enthusiasm. But the research suggests they are more capable of self-correction when the costs of that enthusiasm begin to accumulate. None of these are guarantees. The mechanisms are old, they are deep, and they are, in the short term, neurologically rewarding in ways that make them very difficult to resist from inside them. But the research is consistent that understanding the mechanism is the precondition for everything else. You cannot interrupt a process you cannot see. The populations who cheered at the start of wars that later destroyed them were not stupid. They were not uniquely susceptible. They were not a different kind of human being from the people reading this or watching this. They were people whose brains were doing exactly what the human brain does under specific conditions, seeking meaning, seeking belonging, resolving existential anxiety, protecting identity, and responding to social environments. The specific war changes. The mechanism does not. Understanding that mechanism does not make anyone immune to it, but it creates something the mechanism cannot function against, the recognition in real time of what is happening. The capacity to look at the certainty, the specific quality of moral conviction that war enthusiasm produces, and ask not whether the cause is just, but where this feeling of certainty is coming from. What need it is meeting, what it would cost to question it, and whether the cost of questioning it is the cost the mechanism is charging to protect itself, rather than the cost of actually being wrong. History is not made of villains and victims. It is made of ordinary people running ordinary psychological mechanisms in extraordinary conditions. The distance between them and us is smaller than we prefer to believe, which is precisely why understanding the mechanism matters as much as it does. If the mechanisms we examine here are useful to you, the archive has more than 25 episodes covering patterns like this one at the level of the documented research. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. We'll see you in the next one.